I feel like this is the book that I have been looking for probably since I was a teenager, just because I had this sense of like, there's gotta be a way to feel better than this, to have my brain work better than this. And there is, and this book is all about that. So if you've had the kind of life that leaves you having a hard time thinking clearly or regulating your emotions or having close relationships, this book would be like my number one recommendation.
My guest today is Catherine Roebuck. Catherine is an amazing relationship coach, and she's also my sister. We're here to talk about Dr. David Schnarch's last book. She and I lovingly call this book The Manuscript because when David suddenly died in 2020, he left this book as a finished but unpublished manuscript. This book was released as a free PDF 3 weeks ago, and since then, Catherine and I have spent a lot of time talking about how amazing it is. And so now we're here to share that conversation with you. And so, do you want to tell me about Mariana Trench?
Yeah, so that's the title of the book. Living at the Bottom of the Ocean is this metaphor that he's using for living underwater when you're regressed, that you are just not functioning very well. And you have the capacity to function better, but so you're coming off as less capable, less intelligent than you really are because of the way your brain's working. So the Mariana Trench is the deepest, darkest, coldest part of the ocean. And he's talking about this as a metaphor for like as bad as it can get for you when you're functioning at your worst. This is when you are screaming your head off at someone or totally shutting down or struggling to put words together, and he talks about this as a place that most people go at some point. And it's just about how much time do you spend there, and are you able to get yourself out of this and get yourself, closer to the surface and maybe even to shore.
And he uses this amazingly rich imagery. So he talks about the ugly fish at the bottom of the ocean and then the fun little tropical fish at the top of the ocean, and how when I'm regressed, I'm swimming at the bottom of the ocean and I'm an ugly fish. And I'm one of those fish that has like giant pointy triangle teeth and like a lantern hanging out from my forehead that says, come over here so I can eat you, right? And that's really all I'm capable of doing is like eat or be eaten. I'm not capable of love or friendship or caring or cherishing or all these things that we want to have in our life, but you and I have both struggled just trying to figure out how exactly to do that.
Right. And he even puts pictures in the book of these ugly fish at the bottom of the ocean. So he's really focusing on this, bringing in imagery and bringing in the right brain so that you can access parts of your brain that are not as engaged in analytical thinking, because they have a lot to do with both how you get regressed and how you get out of it.
The left brain deals in ideas and in words and in sequences and logic, and the right brain is images and sensations. And so all of the work that he tells us how to do is based in the right brain, even though it uses words in a specific way that engages the right brain, because he's a big believer in healing our brains through the right brain instead of, I guess, what is more of a traditional therapy model, which is more left brain centered.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I loved about this book is it does draw on a lot of the modalities that have been really helpful to me. Like he talks about waking up in this book, and he talks about how he's using that the same way as Buddhism uses it. And Buddhism has been super influential for me. I know it has been for you too. And there's also a lot about somatic awareness, using your body sensations to be able to track what's happening for you, and also to be able to actually change your emotions through what you do with your body sensations. So he's just drawing on some of the most effective tools I've found to this point for dealing with the types of difficulties life throws at us. And he puts it all together just so elegantly in this book to where it makes sense as a cohesive model of, what went wrong and how you fix it. And it does have a lot to do with you're engaging the right brain, but you're also connecting it with the left brain. So he talks a lot about integrating these two kinds of memory that we have. And the one we think most about is our narrative memory. But there's another way that data is recorded that is more sensory based. And it helps your brain calm down a lot and organize itself a lot if you can integrate the information that's in those two parts of your memory.
Yeah, so I like to call that reprocessing. The way I think about it is, when something happened to me, I recorded it into visual memory. And then I instantly created some kind of an interpretation in verbal memory. So the timestamp and the context and the significance and what it all means, like the moral of the story. I created a moral of the story. So something scary happened to me when I was a kid. I created the moral of the story that says, this type of situation is dangerous, watch out. And so then that creates a trigger point in my mind. And when I am exposed to something that reminds me of that situation, then I trigger. And then I might go into some sort of panic or heightened awareness or, what we call a trigger reaction or a trauma reaction. So by going back into visual memory and reanalyzing it with my adult brain, I can create a better interpretation of what actually happened and also put a better timestamp on it and reprocess it and say, this happened 20 years ago and look at how much has changed between now and then. I think it makes that memory less daunting to me because it recontextualizes it into, this was a long time ago, this was far away. This happened to a person who was much less powerful and capable than who I am today.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It has so much to do with context and clarity. And one way I've been thinking about this is like when you're a kid and you see some lumpy shadow by your closet at night and you're really worried it could be a monster. And if you turn the light on, you get a better view of what's actually over there and you realize, oh, that's just my hoodie. Then you can relax. So I think that's a lot of what's going on with triggers is that you only have a very hazy picture of what the problem was. And the clearer you can make that picture, the more your brain can contextualize that fear so that you don't have to be afraid of everything that is vaguely the same shape as that. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And then, like you said about bringing in the context of you're a different person now with different capacities, different resources, you're not 7 years old anymore. And to really update your brain and synchronize your memory so that that's how that information is on board when you come in contact with something that sort of reminds you of a scary monster from when you were a kid.
So he proposes writing exercises. Tell me about the first one, which is revisualizations.
Visualization is just going back into a difficult experience, something that was confusing or upsetting in some way, and watching the scene. As much as possible, you're trying to watch it like it's a movie. When I started doing this, I did not have anywhere near the mental imagery capacity to be able to do that. And so I just work with what I had, any visual information I could pull up about the space it was in and where the people were positioned and just anything. But it has gotten much clearer with practice. And what you're doing is trying to watch this from, if you're able to, you want to try to watch it from a third person perspective, because typically the first thing you pull up is a first person. And you'll get more data from a third person view. And one of the things that you'll get data about is your own face, what was happening, what was visible on your face as this difficult thing happened. And one of the reasons that really matters is that's data that the person you were having a hard time with in that memory had, that they could see what was happening on your face just like you can when you revisualize this. One of the things Schnarch talks about is that we often drop from our memory our awareness that our antagonist, which is just whoever we were having a difficult interaction with, had mind mapping ability, which means that they could understand what we were experiencing more or less. They knew their impact as they were doing something that was difficult to deal with. It's one of those things where just putting it together and giving yourself a clear picture of it, even though it's initially upsetting, it's very calming to your brain. It's like part of you already knew this. The sensory memory already had that information. If you go back in and revisualize, then you connect with that information. By dealing with it in this deliberate way, you integrate that information into your narrative so that you understand this experience as something that happened between you and another person who could see their impact on you.
So it's clarifying, and just like you described, as I've done this with my therapist, so I will write visualizations, send them to her, and she will respond with comments or questions and just kind of help me see more into what was happening or what it means, or try to help me get more clear on what happened and what it means. It is a very disturbing experience for me to do it. So writing the visualizations feels unpleasant. Remembering the things feels unpleasant. Trying to get closer to the people involved feels unpleasant. And just like, it's just stuff that I don't really want to deal with, but to the extent that I don't deal with it, then it continues to impact my life today.
what you can't handle seeing in these difficult memories, you also go blind to in your life now. And so you might have a partner who does the kinds of things that your parents did, for example, or you might do the kinds of things that your parent did, and you can't see yourself doing it clearly enough to stop it or change it. But that thing you describe of how difficult it feels to do this, Schnarch talks about that as well as actually a sign that your brain is getting better, that it goes through what he calls a reactive regression, when you really put something together and you see it more clearly. And it's typically short-lived. You start to see more clearly the messed up things people do to each other and that you do to other people. And then it's unpleasant. Like, there's good reasons that none of us really want to do this, but it's the reason it's so worth doing is that you cannot change it until you can see it. And once you can see it, you can do something different about it. You can stop going along with and colluding in the kinds of dynamics that are hurting you and that are hurting other people.
So tell me about the other tool, which is dialogues.
Yeah, dialogues, if revisualization is emotionally challenging, dialogues are often even more so, because what you're doing is imagining a conversation with an important person who did something that was difficult for you, and you are trying to talk to them directly about it. These are conversations that you typically kind of know that you need to have this. If you were going to have resolution in this relationship, this is what you would need to talk about. And there's a good reason you've not talked about it or haven't talked about it very effectively. So you just write it out like a scene from a play or a movie is how I think about it, that you are trying to paint a picture and you're as much as possible visualizing it as you do it. So I often think about where I would be when I have this conversation, where we would be positioned and how we would be interacting with each other while we talk. And then you're just writing out, if you were to talk directly to this person about their impact on you or how you see them, what would they say? Not in fantasy land where they're telling you what you want to hear, but if they're acting like themselves. And this will often become, it will produce exactly the response that you've been afraid to face in them.
Oftentimes these dialogues are me dealing with a parent. When I was young, my mind was programmed to not get too close to my parents' mind just because I was a kid and I couldn't handle it. And there was often something there that wasn't healthy for me to know about, but the actual memory is still there, hidden behind this verbal interpretation. If I can go back in. And so by writing the dialogue, I have to get close enough to my parents' mind to say, well, what do they actually think? How do they really feel about me? What's actually happening? How do I handle that? How do I stand up to this person? How do I talk to them in a direct way? Something that would not have been possible for me as a child.
And it's incredible what it can do to your functioning when you can do this. Like, people have really dramatic shifts in how well they can think and how much energy they have and how they feel physically, even often within days of doing this kind of work. So the payoff is, it's difficult stuff, but the payoff is so real.
To the extent that you're comfortable talking about, how has this work affected you? What benefit have you seen from it?
My whole adult life has been trying to find out what I could do with my brain, because I started out adulthood with the sense that I had a pretty bad brain. I had been really pretty miserable as a child, and I was deeply depressed my freshman year of college. And I had this epiphany moment where a doctor prescribed me antidepressants, and he said, this is going to get you back to feeling like you did before depression. I'm like, I can't remember before depression. And it stayed with me, and it bothered me. And it also got me curious. It got me thinking about what if there's an after? What if I don't always have to be on these meds and I don't always have to feel this way and live this way? And a lot of the things that I found that have helped me do come up in this book, like the mindfulness and, being able to calm yourself down through your physiology. That's something that I learned through Buddhism. But this work specifically has been massively impactful for me. Working with a therapist that trained with Dr. Schnarch that does this type of work, it's expanded my capacity to stay calm in difficult situations, my ability to see clearly what's happening in my own life and in clients' lives. It's made me really patient with my kids. And it also gives me a lot of hope for people in general. Like I can see people do really messed up stuff without feeling too upset at them about it, because I'm just like, they're drowning. They're underwater. That's what's happening here. And the imagery Schnarch uses is he'll tell people, like, swim as hard as you can for the surface. That's what you got to do. And it's such useful imagery, because a lot of therapeutic work, you end up swimming kind of in circles and never actually getting any higher, has been my experience. But I'd say that's what's so different about this work, is how quick and dramatic the impact of it is. That, yeah, I see changes in my mood and my health and how many hours I can work, like how well I sleep, all kinds of things.
Are you comfortable saying how it's changed your work with clients?
I've been doing written mental dialogues for a long time with clients now, but I've started doing the visualizations as well. And it just gives me much more information to go off of about what it was really like for them to grow up in the family they grew up in, and how their mind works, and how the minds that they were most exposed to worked. Because that can tell you a lot about how they're seeing the world and what they see as possible and what they see as important. So one of the things that it shifts is giving me a much better sense of where I could meet a client that would matter to them. What's something that we could work toward that would be worth swimming as hard as they could. That is different for different people. And it's pretty specific. And it has a lot to do with what you couldn't get in childhood and what you wanted.
Yeah. One of the things that, that phrase, waking up in a nightmare, has really rung true to me over the past month or so, as I've become more aware of the impact I had on my wife and children, becoming aware of the degree to which I'm disconnected from people who matter to me, and how hard it is for me to just really show up in my most important relationships the way I want to. And this book has been really helpful for me in identifying and becoming aware of that. And it also offers a path towards doing something about that.
I have clients sometimes be like, well, that sounds hard. Basically, like, I wouldn't want to do that. And, well, you don't have to. But if you find something easier, by all means, loop me in. I have not found anything that works as well as this. And it's, in my experience, it is not harder than just living in the nightmare of sleep. The toll that takes is enormous, and it just is coming out in different ways. It's coming out in not enjoying your life, not feeling very vibrant or alive, even if your life looks good on the surface, not enjoying your family and your important connections. It really it can impact your health. You can have chronic symptoms that you can't address through physical means. I mean, the costs of going through your life not having a clear view of your family and your life are huge. So to me, this is the easier, better path.
So if someone's listening to this and they're wondering if they might be regressed, how could they tell?
Well, Schnarch says just assume you are. So yeah, I think you can assume that you're regressed. It's easier to recognize that you go in when you go into an acute regression, because that's like losing your temper. Regressions happen in situations that are high meaning and high anxiety. And so they don't even have to be negative situations. Like one of the classic examples is like an actor wins an award that means a lot to them, and they go up to give their speech and they're like forgetting everything and stumbling over their words and stuff. And, they're winning this award for how eloquent they are and how good they are at being able to say the right thing in the right way at the right time. And those same skills that we all know they have because they just won this award for it are completely inaccessible to them in that moment. So that's, one way a regression can show up is that skills that you have, you can't access in a high stress or high meaning situation. I mean, for me, a lot of it is brain fog, that there's just it's very difficult to think clearly if I'm regressed. It can come through as emotional volatility, that you're just super irritable and you react to everything, or you blow up at your family, so there are a lot of things you can look for, but it's really just anytime you have a sense of like, I'm not doing well, this is not my best, and I can't seem to change that in this moment. You're probably dealing with a regression.
Work to know that I've come out of regression, then it's reasonable to assume that I'm regressed in some way. And then a lot of it depends on, what kind of family did I grow up in. And like the examples in the book are all about them dealing with the reality of the impact their parents had on them and how that's affected them later in life. Why is it the parents?
I think there's no way around how much parents matter, which I've got kids. There's no way around this. So, but I just see that as inescapable just because this is your initial model of how the world works comes from your parents' minds. When you are really little and you're starting to learn, like, what are the rules? How do I handle life? How do we do relationships? What does all of this mean? You're going to reference your caretakers. There's no way around that. And so the impact's going to be enormous. And then just by virtue of the amount of time that parents spend with their kids, the significance of that relationship, how much it matters to both people involved, it's going to impact your brain. And it's not about blaming the parents, because it's not this idea of most people are going around functioning well and your parents are not. Your parents came by their problems honestly. Typically they inherited them from having similar parenting themselves. And it's just, you have to, if you're going to change the pattern, break the cycle, you have to work with the part of it that you can see clearly. That's going to be the part that you have memory of. You can't do a whole lot with the content of your parents' and grandparents' relationship because you don't have enough data to go off of. You can do a lot with your relationship with your parents.
I like to think of it as an intergenerational torrent of stuff that has been flowing down through the family for hundreds of years. And it's not a question of, did I have good parents or bad parents, or was it their fault, or did they do the best they could? I don't think any of those questions are very important. I think the important question is, there is a lot of stuff that has been flowing down for a long time, and what am I going to do about it, right? Because I'm not going to stop all of it from affecting my children. I also have children, and it's not realistic to say I'm going to keep all this stuff from affecting my children. That's not going to happen. But I do have an opportunity to stop some of it from affecting my children and to create a better experience for my children than what I grew up with. And that's, I think, is the core of what parenting is.
Yeah. And Schnarch says, kids don't need perfect parents. They don't need you to never hurt them, never make mistakes. What they need is for you to be willing to be seen, to be honest about who you are and what you've done, and to not insist on a distorted picture of yourself. If you insist on being seen as doing things for their benefit when that wasn't really your motivation, that's what messes with the kid's mind. If you insist on them believing an explanation that doesn't hold together, doesn't make sense, it's not that you lost your temper and yelled that's the problem. It's what you do with that afterward.
Yeah. After reading this book, I had a conversation with one of my children where that exact conversation, we had this disagreement years ago where he wanted to do one thing with the summer and I wanted to do something else with the summer. And his interpretation has always been, Dad, you just weren't parenting me very well in that moment. And he's been angry about this for a long time. And I've always maintained that my version of how he should spend his summer was better than his. And I went back and talked to him and I said, you know what, you were right. I was trying to change your behavior for my benefit, not for yours. And you could see that, and I kept telling you that wasn't happening. But you knew all along that's what it was. And so in this instance, I don't think he ever went completely blind to me. But there were probably times where that same thing happened when he was much younger, when he would have been blind. And then I was basically contributing to his difficulty seeing the world accurately because I'm encouraging him to see me in a way that's not accurate or authentic. And so I'm trying to get him to see me as being a more positive influence on him than I really am. And that map gets stuck in his brain to a certain extent, and it makes it hard for him to see people clearly, later in life. And especially, once he gets into committed relationships and things like that, it's going to be harder for him to see his partner clearly and see himself clearly.
Yeah, and Schnarch talks about how as you resolve your regressions, then your kids feel much more comfortable and safe mapping your mind, and that it resolves traumatic mind mapping. It repairs the impacts on their brain of the mistakes you have made. When you get to where you're trustable, that you're not going to fall apart and blame them for it or take it out on them, and that you let them map you accurately. You don't insist on a dishonest picture of yourself. And so it's not that you have to go back to every single and remember every time that you got it wrong and deal with it all individually. You have to be willing to talk about some of them, especially the big ones and the ones that matter to your kids. But so much of the repair work is just you cleaning up your own brain and being able to function better now.
So Catherine, thank you so much for coming. Before we wrap this up, tell us a little bit about who you work with and where we can find you.
I work with couples and individuals, just anyone who wants help learning to love themselves and each other better. That's my whole deal. And you can find me at catroebuck.com or email me at cat@catroebuck.com.
And you work with people throughout the world, is that right?
I do, yeah. I work with people all over the world.
Okay, and I will put your website and email in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming.
All right, thanks, James.
Thank you for listening to this interview with Catherine Roebuck. If you want to support this show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or comment and subscribe on YouTube. I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you soon.